So the rise in the past few weeks of the coronavirus has in many ways laid bare, I think, some realities about our modern world. One of those realities is the interconnection of all humanity across lines of country and nation, across continents. This interconnection so much so that something that happens in some small corner of China affects Iran and India, Italy, affects all parts of the world. And while the coronavirus creates a lot of fear, it is interesting to see some of the responses to this reality, this flu-like pandemic that is cropping up in different parts of the world. There's the silly response. Someone shared with me this week an article that indicated that Corona beer has lost 40% of its production or sales because people are afraid of getting coronavirus. What a way to go, I guess. Then there's the kind of panic that's kind of alarming we see in Wall Street. I must admit it's easier for me probably to discern the mysterious presence and spirit of God than to figure out how the stock market works, but it has been a huge response of fear and anxiety, and it is a kind of scary thing, a reality of this flu-like epidemic that may be arising in our midst. And in many ways, it says something about the reality of our world and our response to it. I know one of the challenges is that in many ways it will highlight the already existing inequalities, the systems of injustice that exist in our communities anyway, even though for most of us it might have a minor symptoms and things like that, it does attack or can be more harmful to the most vulnerable. And one of the challenges also is that something like the flu, something like the coronavirus, often impacts the more vulnerable of our community, the poor, and those who couldn't afford to take the time off that would be needed if a pandemic erupted, who couldn't afford the child care to take care of their kids if the schools were not getting, who couldn't afford the simple medical prescriptions and medicines and health care. So it does highlight, in many ways, some of the unjust things that exist in our world, that the most vulnerable among us would be probably the greatest impact. But the other response that can so easily happen that strikes me as this begins to infiltrate our news and begin to talk about this, is this kind of response of fear, right? And part of that fear comes out maybe in a panic on Wall Street, but it might come out in people being so frightened they may start hoarding things. And you're beginning to see in some parts of the world hoarding different things because they're afraid that if it happens, there will be great scarcity, right? That there will be, in a sense, part of our fear about that is that there's not really a sense in which we would kind of take care of each other, but we'd all be out on our own, right? And the reality is that more often than not, injustice and inequality exists because we look at the world and we say there's not enough for everyone. Injustice is about a worldview that looks at the world and sees scarcity. That struck me as we read this passage known as the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And we are told that Jesus, and scarcity shows up in this in many ways. We're told that Jesus, upon hearing the news of his mentor, his friend, John the Baptist, being killed by those in power, he goes off, it says, to a deserted place to pray. He's in pain. He's grieving. He needs a place to kind of recenter himself. And the story goes that as he emerges from that, a great crowd with a huge, this great crowd calling for healing and needing his presence, needing him to care for them and heal them, arrive to him, and then he begins that healing. And then the story goes at this deserted place that what happens is that the disciples begin to realize, well, this is a big crowd. They need to get food for themselves, so you need to dismiss them, and they need to go off to local villages and fend for themselves. And what strikes me about that is the sense in which the disciples, I think out of a place of compassion, are trying to warn Jesus, these people need to go. There's not enough, right? There's a scarcity of stuff here, of food. And it's not enough to feed everybody. So everybody go and fend for themselves, right? To each their own. And the reality is, when we live in a world of scarcity, when we live in that kind of world, we kind of expect that of people. Well, you got to take care of your own. You got to fend for yourself. I get mine, and maybe you get yours. But Jesus says, no. The reality is, there's more than enough here right now. And so he pulls everybody together. We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he says, this will feed everybody. And the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 happens. Now, what strikes me about that passage is I'm not sure if the miracle, maybe Jesus did some hocus pocus and broke the bread and created a lot more bread and fish, and that could very well be possible. That could be the miracle. That's what Jesus did. But I wonder if the more profound miracle was to convince this crowd of 5,000 that we could share. That actually there's plenty for everyone. Maybe that's the miracle, is Jesus convinces those who only see scarcity to realize there's abundance that can feed everybody here. So much so that there's 12 baskets full afterwards. I've always wondered why 12. I wondered if that had something to say about the 12 disciples. I don't know. But that there was so much plenty if people would simply see it and share. Not out of fear, but out of compassion. Now for Jesus, justice is not an idea. It's not a political program. Justice is not some ideological pursuit. Justice is intertwined with love. It's all interconnected. And it's intertwined with God's love. Now, there's a famous theologian, his name was Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote a book back in the 70s that was profoundly affected theology. It was a book called The Theology of Liberation. And in it, for the first time in a long, long time, the church began to take seriously. He wrote about the suffering in South America and Central America, the profound inequality and poverty that existed, where people starved right next to people who just had banquets and parties. And he said the church has to wrestle with this because that's exactly what Jesus wrestled with. And the genius of Gutierrez's ideas wasn't that he was talking about justice again as some political idea. That was not a bad program or social program. What drove Jesus, Gutierrez says, is the grace of God. That God's love is so gratuitous, that God's love is so big, that God's love is so abundant that it spills out on everyone. And so, justice is God's grace spilling out so abundantly on everyone, the rich and poor, black and white. It is a belief that God's love is so abundant and God provides so much abundance that justice reigns. So part of the challenge, Gutierrez would say to us, is that our discipleship in caring for those who are hungry and thirsty and naked and afraid and strangers is rooted in our discipleship to a Jesus who saw God's grace so big and abundant, it creates justice. I think part of the reason we think justice is so impossible is we really cannot believe in the abundance of God's grace. Now, there are many afraid in difficult times and times in which we may face disasters. A number of our members are wearing their Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Incident today, a day to lift up Presbyterian disaster assistance. And I want to share with you, and I've shared with many of you before, that one of the areas I studied when I was in graduate school in sociology was, as bizarre as it sounds, academics study the weirdest things, was a thing called the sociology of disaster. That actually people study disasters and human responses to it. And if you talk to Greg or Bob Hauser or anybody who's worked on Presbyterian disaster assistance, they would tell you that what I'm about to describe is actually amazingly true. Now, our image, as sociologists studied this, the image we have when something like a coronavirus happens or a tornado or a flooding disaster, our image is kind of like the burning Inferno, Tower of Inferno, a disaster in which everybody is kind of turned against everybody, right? Our image that human nature is everybody's going to seek their own selfish concerns. They're going to take care of themselves and their family and not mess with helping anybody else. And that often is the image of when a disaster happens that we see portrayed in entertainment and some of the stories we might read. So much so that we think, well, yeah, that's what it means to be human, is when bad things happen. That's not surprising. You know, we live in a world where you get your own, and that's it. The reality is, when sociologists study disasters and the responses, the exact opposite was true. That human beings didn't naturally turn on each other, that actually, in some ways, they began to bond together in ways they had never before. That issues of race and class and creedal differences begin to disappear because people take care of each other and abundantly share what they have with each other, almost to the point that there's too much. So we seek justice, not because it's some idea. We feed the hungry, give water to the drink, not because we do it out of the abundance of God's grace in our own lives and in this world. And only when we forget that abundance, become so afraid that our world is filled with scarcity, Only then does justice seem impossible. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.